Welcome back, everybody, to another week of Sunday School here at the Lighthouse Church of the Nazarene in Moravia, Iowa, where we are going through the book of John. Right now, we're right in the middle of John chapter 18, and we left off last week at verse 11. So what has just happened? Jesus has finished giving the upper room discourse and the high priestly prayer of Jesus. We find that in John chapter 13 through 16. The high priestly prayer of Jesus is John chapter 17. So Jesus has finished talking to his disciples, and they've now went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. When they get to the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas shows up, it says, with a great multitude of people. We don't know how many, but William Barclay says that it was at least 200, just by the language that the Bible gives us. So Judas has shown up with a great multitude of people. Peter, he tries to intervene, cuts off a guy's ear. We don't get it in the book of John, but Jesus actually goes and heals the man's ear. His name was Malchus. So that's where we left off. Jesus has now been arrested. All the other disciples took him. They forsook Jesus and fled. So we're going to start right now in John chapter 18, verse 12. Let's get out our Bibles and let's follow along. John chapter 18, verse 12. Then the detachment of troops and the captain and officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. This actually shows us that there were two groups of people. There were the Romans, the detachment of troops, which what I just said, that numbered at least 200 people, could have been 600 or even more. We had the Roman soldiers, plus we had the captains and officers of the Jews. That was the Jewish temple police. Remember, they had already tried to arrest Jesus, and they come back to the high priest and said, no man's ever spoken like this man. We can't arrest him. So this shows us that there were two groups, the Romans and the Jewish officers, all there to arrest Jesus. And look what it says they did to Jesus. Notice it says that they arrested him and they bound him. I find it kind of humorous that they actually bound Jesus. This is the same guy that in just a moment earlier, by just his breath, knocked the whole contingent of them to the ground. And what do? They feel like they need to tie him up, like that's going to do any good. The guy that can calm storms with just his voice, perform miracles, God in the flesh, they feel the need to tie him up. If you remember when we were going through the book of Judges, do you remember how they always would tie Samson up? One time they did it with new ropes. Another time they did it with 7 fresh bowstrings. What would Samson always do with them? He would always just snap them right there. Remember, we always need to remember this. Jesus was a volunteer. He was not a victim. He willingly went with them, but he was in complete control the whole time. Remember, Jesus said, I could call down 12 legions of angels right now if I wanted to. So Jesus, he was in complete control the whole time. We need to remember this. He willingly did all of this. In verse 13, and they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. So Jesus is actually about to go through 6 different trials. We don't get them all in the book of John, but when we combine all the Gospels together, Jesus actually has 6 different trials that he goes before. This first one is Annas. Then from Annas, he's going to go to Caiaphas, who was high priest. Then early in the morning, he's going to appear before the Sanhedrin. They send him to the Praetorium in front of Pilate. What does Pilate do? Pilate then sends him to Herod. Herod says, I wanted to see you. I wanted to meet you. Jesus doesn't speak a word in front of Herod, and then Herod sends him back to Pilate. So when we combine all the Gospels together, we find that Jesus actually went through 6 different trials. So who is this first one? He is first going to appear before Annas. Now, Annas is not the high priest. It's his son-in-law Caiaphas who is. But Annas had been the high priest, and he actually will be again after this, because we find it in Acts 4:6, where it says that Peter and John, they appeared before Annas, who was the high priest. Annas' name also appears in Luke 3:2, clear back when Jesus was born, and Quirinius made him the high priest. There's a man named Alfred Edersheim, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He wrote a book in the 1800s titled The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah. And he described Annas as ruthless and a hoarder of money. And it says that Annas was the one that was in charge of the bazaars where they were selling everything. And it was just really a big scam. You remember Jesus twice had to cleanse the temple. He came in, drove out all the money changers, overturned their tables, made a whip of cords. He did that twice. And what we find out is that they were actually laundering money through this. People would come in with a sacrifice. They would say, oh, that sacrifice is no good. Luckily for you, we have this already inspected sacrifice that we will sell you at an inflated price. So Jesus twice destroyed those, but we find out that Annas was the one that was actually in charge of that, and that he was the one actually making all the money off of that. So I'm sure Annas was upset at Jesus and couldn't wait to have Jesus standing before him to teach him a lesson. So where are we at? Verse 14. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, what are we talking about here? Caiaphas actually made this prophecy clear back in John chapter 11. After Jesus brought Lazarus out of the grave, some people said, look at this man, look at all the signs he's doing. But some of them went and told the high priest what Jesus was doing. So then Caiaphas and they all gathered a council and they said, what shall we do? This man works many signs. If we leave him alone, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. But then it says, this is in John chapter 11, Caiaphas, being high priest, said, you know nothing at all, nor do you realize that it is better for us that one man should die for the people than that the whole nation should perish. So Caiaphas was the one that made that prophecy. John is just reminding us of it right here. All right, where are we at? Verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now, it says that Peter followed Jesus. Peter wasn't right behind Jesus going, no, don't take him, don't take him. If you go to Luke 22:54, it says that Peter followed from a distance. So Peter wasn't right there. Peter was following him from a distance, staying in the shadows, wanting to see what was going on. Now, where were all the other disciples? The other disciples, they're all long gone. It says they all forsook him and fled. In the book of Matthew, it tells that. So let's see. We have Peter and John right here. So the other 9 disciples, they all forsook him and fled. Verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Now, who is this another disciple? I just said who it probably is. Most people believe that it was John, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Most people believe that it was John. But we have to ask, well, how would John have known the high priest? The theory is that John was in the fishing business with his brother and his dad, Zebedee, but also Peter was in that same business. We get it from Luke chapter 5. They were all in business together. But some people think that John was actually the delivery man for the salted fish that went to the high priest every day, and that is how John knows him. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. This also could be somebody else besides John, and we all just assume it's John because it's his gospel and he doesn't name himself by name. It could be Nicodemus. It could be Joseph of Arimathea. So those are just some of the theories. Most likely John. So verse 15, Simon Peter followed Jesus. We know he's following from a distance, and so did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. So Peter's obviously not known to these people. He couldn't get in. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Verse 17. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, you are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. Now, this is the first denial of Peter. If you remember, Jesus said, he told Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Here is the first one. Now, this should have been an easy question to answer yes to, because notice how she says this. She says, hey, you're not also one of this man's disciples, are you? It seems to imply that she knew that whoever was with Peter was a disciple. So she's saying, well, you're not also one of this man's disciples like this guy. And obviously nothing was happening to that guy. So you'd think it would have been easy for Peter to say, oh, yeah, I'm with him. What's the lesson here? Never, ever, ever be ashamed of knowing Jesus. Never be ashamed of being a follower of Jesus. What did Jesus say about that? He said, whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him the Son of Man will also be ashamed. We need never be ashamed of Jesus. What did Paul say? I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. But here we have Peter's first denial. Now let's go to verse 18 here. Now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, And Simon Peter stood with them and warmed himself. This is interesting to think about right here. Notice that it was cold enough that they needed to build a fire to warm themselves. That tells us it was cold out. We also know that it was a full moon just by the time of the year it is. But this also shows us something. In the book of Luke, it tells us that Jesus, while he was praying, he was profusely sweating like great drops of blood. So we know that it's cold enough out that everybody else needs a fire just to keep warm. But the agony that Jesus was going through was causing him to sweat profusely. Just something interesting to think about. Verse 19, the high priest, this is Annas, then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Verse 21, why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. What Jesus is actually saying here is, hey, where are your guys' witnesses? That Jewish law, you needed 2 or 3 witnesses. It's Deuteronomy 19:15, which says, one witness shall not arise against a man concerning any iniquity, but by the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses, every matter shall be established. So Jesus is just saying, hey, I don't see any witnesses. Where are the men that have testimony against me? Now, we know that they actually will go out and find people that will give false testimony to condemn Jesus to death. But we don't read about that yet. What we have right here is the perfect example of what would be referred to as a kangaroo court. I don't know how that term came about, kangaroo court, but look at this. It's in the middle of the night. There's no witnesses, and they want to do one thing, pronounce guilt on Jesus. That's all they want to do. So Jesus says, why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said. Indeed, they know what I said. Verse 22. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? Apparently, this was the standard in the presence of the high priest, because later on in the book of Acts, we actually find the same thing happening to Paul. And Paul says to that one who struck him, he says, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. I think it's in Acts chapter 22 or 23, somewhere around there. So we see actually the same thing happening to Paul later on that happened to Jesus right here. Jesus, that guy smacked him right in the mouth. What does Jesus say? Why do you strike me? Verse 23, Jesus answered, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? I'm sure Jesus had this guy in mind when he's hanging on the cross and says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. This man, also with many of the others, I'm sure Jesus had in mind. All right, let's keep going here. Verse 24. Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. So the first trial of Jesus is now over. Now Jesus is being sent to Caiaphas. One thing, only in the book of John do we get this first trial before Annas. John is the only one that tells us about that. None of the other gospels have this trial of Annas. Verse 25. Now Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, are you not also one of this man's disciples? Are you? He denied it and said, I am not. Now, I wonder how many people are around this fire right now. We don't know. But do you know how they know that Peter isn't from around there? It actually tells us this in the other Gospels. But they said, hey, we know you're a Galilean, for your speech betrays you. Peter had a different accent. So that's how they know, like, hey, something's different about this guy. Verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? So now we have a relative of Malchus. The same guy that Peter just chopped his ear off said, hey, I know this guy. You can imagine that Peter was probably now getting pretty scared. And we also get from the other Gospels, Matthew and Mark specifically, that Peter didn't just deny Jesus and said, no, I don't know him. It says that he began to curse and swear. That's how profusely that Peter was denying Jesus. So verse 26, one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, did I not see you in the garden with him? Verse 27, Peter then denied again. Remember, he was cursing and swearing that he does not know Jesus. And immediately a rooster crowed. Now, a couple other things. We also learn from the book of Luke that Jesus and Peter were within eyesight of each other. It says that when Peter denied him this third time, that Jesus actually turned and looked at him. And what did Peter do then? It says he went out and wept bitterly. So we've got the 3 denials of Peter, the rooster crowed. We've got 2 trials of Jesus. He's now going to go appear before the Sanhedrin and then to Pilate. So I think we're done for this week. Next week, we're going to start right up where we left off. It'll take us 3 weeks to get through John 18, but it's getting good, isn't it? I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you the same time, same place next week. Bye.